Thank you so much, Congressmember Bass, for joining us today. You are the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, which has earned the moniker the conscience of the Congress. But I found out recently that that was also shared with Congressman Lewis. Tell me why and how Congressman Lewis has ensured that the CBC could continue to carry that moniker on.
Well, you know, today was such a incredible day to watch him go home, to watch him be laid to rest. And he was what we call the dean of the caucus because he was the longest serving member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And it was just, you know, the moral standing that he always had. No one ever questioned him. And in 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, bar none, there was no one who was as respected as Mr. Lewis. He often said to me, Karen, would you please call me John? And I said, no, Mr. Lewis, I'm not calling you John, I'm calling you Mr. Lewis. But his standing and just, and everybody knowing what he had been through, you know, that's why he was called the conscience of the Congress.
I love that. You also just think about so often he's branded as this voting rights champion, but he truly did carry that same conscientiousness into every aspect of legislating. He was a subcommittee chair on Ways and Means, which we know is a super coveted spot. Can you talk, Ms. Bass, about some of your experiences with him, even in dealing with health disparities? I know an issue that's near and dear to your heart. From the legislative perspective, because so often we only talk about Mr. Lewis crossing the bridge, but we don't talk about all of the miles he's gone since then in public service and as a legislator.
Absolutely. Well, serving on Ways and Means, he essentially was the one who drew the line in the sand over the safety net. And if you just think about Mr. Lewis, it would be completely consistent with crossing that bridge and fighting for voting rights, because voting rights is so fundamental that of course he would fight to protect the programs that take care of the people in our country that are the most vulnerable. Whether you were talking about food stamps, our public assistance, our child care, our Social Security, those are the programs that he would handle in the Ways and Means Committee. But I want to tell you about two other things, because Mr. Lewis was also a historian. And when I got here, one of the things that used to bother me about being in the Capitol is that I knew my ancestors built this building. I knew they did. I knew the enslaved Africans built this building, but I didn't know what their story was, and no one told their story. So when I got here, Mr. Lewis told me that he spent 10 years digging and finally found the information. And what happened with this building is that the US government rented enslaved Americans from plantations that surrounded the Washington, D.C. area. And they brought them over here. Of course, they worked for free, but the US government paid their quote unquote owners. I hate to use that expression. And then the statue that's on the top of the Capitol, the folks couldn't figure out how to get it up there. It was an enslaved man who told them how to put that huge statue of a woman up on the top of the Capitol. The other thing that we all can treasure that he did, he led the fight to get the African American History and Cultural Museum built. Angela, do you know that they spent 100 years trying to get that museum built? The first legislation was introduced shortly after the Civil War. In 1930, the legislation was passed. And then when Mr. Lewis came, he picked up that baton and he fought for it year after year after year. And it took Bush 41 Bush 43 to put the money into the legislation that allowed the museum to be built. And then President Obama was the one that cut the ribbon. And so you talk about a legacy. Now that's a legacy of Mr. Lewis that the entire country can experience, because I'm hoping that everybody comes by and visits our museum. That's what I call it. It's my museum. Of course, it's closed now because of COVID, but it'll be open soon.
Yeah, and it sure is ours. And you know, you think about not only Mr. Lewis's regular fight for us on the House floor, in the committee room, and to your point around the museum, which we call the Blacksonian. I didn't realize that, I did not realize that it had been introduced for 100 years. I know that he initially partnered with Mickey Leland.
Yes.
And his pledge to Mr. Leland was, I'm going to make sure that this bill gets passed. So for 15 sessions, he introduced that bill. And I'm sitting here like tearing up, thinking about all of the aspects of history that you're talking about. And the first thing that comes to mind, I'm about to cry, is Mr. Lewis, his official photo, which has the Capitol in the background, and that he had that office in Cannon, so that he could have that view of the Capitol. So it's just like this awe-inspiring full circle moment where there you all are, making the ancestors proud every single day and making it a better place to live and to thrive in this country, with the legislation that you all work on so diligently every day. Can you tell me, Ms. Bass, about a moment, maybe even in a CBC lunch meeting with Mr. Lewis, that you treasure, something a little more personal? People do always recognize this icon, but we forget that there was a human being sometimes right behind that icon status.
Well, I will tell you, when and if Mr. Lewis heard anybody being negative or being cynical or wanting to give up, he'd grab that microphone and you would get that lecture. Don't give up.
Yeah.
Speak out. Get in good trouble. He would give you that lecture. Because sometimes, that's why the CBC is such a wonderful space. It's the best hour of the week, without a doubt. And that's one of the reasons why. Because all that you go through as a member of Congress, all that you go through as an African-American member of Congress, and then you have an hour to yourself in a week where you can really fellowship and vent and lament and be cynical. But you better not be cynical around Mr. Lewis.
I love that. I love that so much. I also just want to ask you, after this week, with the unanimous consent to rename H.R. 4 the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, what would you say to your Republican colleagues in the Senate as their responsibility? Yes, the bill name is changed, as President Obama said in his eulogy, but what is the next step? What is the next frontier for voting rights in the name of Mr. Lewis and all of the members of the CBC?
Unfortunately, the most obvious thing is that we need to pass the Voting Rights Act, but because of COVID, now we have to make sure that people don't have to put their lives at risk to vote. So we need to be able to vote at home where it's safe. And so that's the next frontier in terms of voting rights, is to pass the Voting Rights Act so we are responsive to the Supreme Court that gutted it and told us we had to fix it. Okay, so we should fix it. But now we have to do double duty because of COVID. We have to make sure that that people can vote safe. All of those people that turned out to vote in Wisconsin, and 50 of them wound up with COVID, And so we have to make sure that they don't really come up with ways to subvert the vote. Now, Angela, that I spend time in Africa and I work on promoting democracy in Africa and go over and tell the African countries they should have elections. Well, I don't have much to say to them right now, because they can look back at us and say, why don't you go clean up what's going on in your house? It's pretty pathetic that our country, after 240 plus years, that we're still struggling for our democracy, for the right to vote. But unfortunately, with the president that we have now, he is cooking up all sorts of dirty tricks to figure out how to slow the post office down, reduce the number of polling places, not allow people to vote at home, make sure they don't get their ballot in time. So where they've applied to vote at home, then they can't go to the polls. So all sorts of shenanigans are going on now to make sure that he stays in power. And so in John Lewis's name And in the name of the 154,000 people that died because of COVID, and you and I know that a large percentage of those are African American, we need to register 5 people for every person that passed away because of COVID. Even Herman Cain, Republican, who went to a rally that Trump planned, didn't have his mask on, died today.
I posted your picture of you talking to Louis Gohmert to put his mask on in committee. I love the power stance in that picture, but also I love that you're being the healthcare professional you are. And speaking of past lives that I think is not too distant, you are an activist yourself,
Yes.
An organizer yourself. And just like Mr. Lewis, before you got to Congress, or before that, the California State Assembly, where you were the first Black woman speaker, you were on the streets with a lot of the young folks who are out here right now protesting to see justice really happen, to see equity and equality really happen in this country. One of the last things we know Mr. Lewis did in Washington, D.C., Congressmember Bass, is to go and stand in the center of Black Lives Matter Plaza right in front of the White House, which is just poetic justice to me. But I would love to hear from you, in addition to standing in solidarity, both figuratively and literally, what else can we do to honor Mr. Lewis's legacy and your own as you work to legislate around these issues that are so important to seeing the advancement of the causes that folks are really literally hitting the streets for right now? What are some of the things that we should do?
Well, first of all, I love that that was his last public act. You know, he went to the hospital right after that. Mm-hmm. And I think he did that. Now, I didn't talk to him, but this is what I imagine he did. That was his passing of the baton to the next generation. I mean, one of the last acts I'm going to do on this earth is to go symbolically tell the next generation, I stand with you. I stand with you. And that's why I'm standing on Black Lives Matter Square. And so to me, that means that we have to answer that call. We have to answer. We can't say that we respect Mr. Lewis and we don't act. And so that's what we have to do. And I'm proud to do that. I feel the weight of that responsibility on my shoulders, but I embrace it, and I'm gonna carry it with me. When I feel down or discouraged, I gotta say, you know what? Mr. Lewis would not stand for that. I don't want to have that lecture in my ear.
Don't give up, don't give in. But I am gonna yield you your time because now I'm crying. And I'm so thankful for you and how you fight for us every single day when we know it and when we don't see it. I'm just so, so grateful for your friendship, for your mentorship, and because I know you're carrying the legacy of Mr. Lewis with you. I'm so grateful that you can make time today, Ms. Bass.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.
Love you. This was good. I really am I'm like, I don't even have tissue over here. But that's so true. That is exactly what he was doing.
All right, we'll see you soon.
Thank you.